Hello. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Welcome to University of Pennsylvania Law School, and welcome to the second CERL book talk of this academic year. Our featured book today is An Innocent Bystander, The Killing of Leon Klinghoffer. This book talk is organized by CERL, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to the preservation and promotion of the rule of law in 21st century warfare and national security. CERL specializes in the ethical dimensions of national security policies and practices and their adherence to the rule of law. We hold events, conduct research, and produce briefing papers and other publications to influence policymakers and educate the public. I see some familiar faces in the audience today from our prior programming, and thank you again for returning for this one. Our featured author today is Julie Salamon. She is a former journalist and critic at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. She is the author of hundreds of articles and 11 fiction and nonfiction books. She has written for The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Vogue, Bazaar, and The New Republic, and has more than 3 million words in print. Is that accurate? I'm feeling very uncomfortable right now.
Which is your favorite?
Our second guest today is Sean Carter, a member of the law firm of Cozen O'Connor. Sean is also a member of CERL's board, and he and his firm have been generous supporters of CERL's internship program. So thank you for your support, and thank you for being here today. Sean is a litigator who represents many families of victims of international terrorism and their claims against sovereign states. And in that, Sean and I have something in common. I, Alexandra Mize, am a fellow here at CERL this academic year, but prior to coming here, I was in private practice, and I've represented dozens of families in suits against state sponsors of terrorism under the terrorism exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Sean is particularly known, though, for his representation of 9/11 victims and their families in a lawsuit against Saudi Arabia related to 9/11. I look forward to hearing about that today. Our discussion is going to be led by Professor Claire Finkelstein, who is our faculty director and founder of CERL, as well as the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy here at Penn Law. Now, a couple of housekeeping items. This program is being live streamed, so we wanted to alert you to that. Also, I ask that you please silence your cell phones now. You do not live in infamy on the internet or in here when your phone goes off. I also wanted to let you know towards the end of the program we're going to be having a Q&A. And after that, there will be a reception, which you're all welcome to join us for upstairs. The book at that time will be made available for purchase, and I believe you will sign it if that's okay at the reception. Wonderful, thank you. I also wanted to let you know that there's going to be an interview with our author this weekend on PBS. That program is going to be titled Innocent Bystanders and the New Terrorism. So please do look that up on your local PBS station if you want to watch that as well. And so before we begin our formal program, I just wanted to make a short note as someone who has worked in cases involving terrorism and with victims and their families. These cases and incidents affect not only the direct victim of terrorism, but everyone around them and have effects for their entire lives. Whether or not a case is successful does not dictate how one is affected by the events that took place. It affects far more than that and lasts a lifetime. These cases draw not only from the law, but from geopolitics, history, and the most intimate nature of humans and humanity. It is the test of people and their institutions at their worst. And I do look forward to hearing from both of our guests today as they comment on that in both legal and non-legal ways. And so with that, I want to thank you again all for coming, and I want to turn the program over to our director. So thank you.
Thank you, Xander. And Xander really should be the one moderating this here today because she knows much more about the subject than I do, but I'm very grateful for her introduction, and it's wonderful to have Xander here as a fellow at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. I'm thrilled to have Julie Salamon here and my good friend Sean Carter to help flesh out all the interesting issues surrounding this topic. I was struck by the PBS title, The New Terrorism, since we're talking about an incident that happened almost 35 years ago. So I just want to start by asking you what led you to go back in time and address this incredibly compelling incident, and whether or not you did have thoughts about its relevance for today as you started to conduct this research.
Well, actually, Xander touched on it in her introduction. The human side of the story is what attracted me initially. Am I making noises here? Okay. The human side of the story attracted me initially. I had known Ilse and Lisa Klinghoffer, who are the daughters of Leon Klinghoffer. We actually go to the same synagogue. I would say we're not friends in that we hadn't gone to each other's houses for dinner, but we certainly are friendly acquaintances. And they invited many people to a 30th anniversary commemoration of the killing of Leon Klinghoffer 4 years ago. This event happened in 1985, and so in 2015, the Klinghoffer daughters were giving their papers to the Center for Jewish History, to the American Jewish Historical Society, and to commemorate that donation of the papers, they were having an event to talk about what had happened to their parents, actually, because Leon's wife, Marilyn, was also on the ship. And so, I really went out of a courtesy to them, not thinking that I would really learn that much new about this event. And what was riveting about that evening was that Ilse and Lisa had been assigned a producer from the Moth Theater Company, which started, I think, after 9/11, doing a lot of personal narratives of people who had gone through 9/11 in New York, and made people tell their personal story in a very intimate way, and helped Lisa and Ilse craft their story into almost a theater performance. And what was fascinating about it was hearing about the story from the point of view of the people waiting back home. The sort of agony of waiting, of not knowing, bringing us back to a time when there were no cell phones, there was no instantaneous communication, what it was like to have this event unfold in real time. But real time was real time back then. It was a delayed time. And so, and then they brought out a fighter pilot who had been sent by his commander, a U.S. fighter pilot from an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, to bring down an airplane that was carrying the hijackers to safety after the hijacking had taken place, and that in itself was very exciting. And then a New York Times reporter who had covered this event from the point of view of the people waiting back at home. And at that time, it wasn't just the Klinghofers, it was all the Americans, many of whom were friends of theirs, going on this cruise together. And as I was listening to this story, it was absolutely riveting. And I thought, if nobody's written a book about this, I'd really like to do it. There had been an opera that was quite controversial, right, but not a book. And so that's really what started me on this.
And the case was very controversial in some ways. The opera really brought that out because of the sympathy for the PLO in this country and for the plight of Palestinians, and at the same time the real anger around having an American victim of terrorism and the sheer barbarity of the act. So maybe you could just go back a little and describe the events. Most people probably are familiar, but for those who don't remember the incident, I remember it very well. In fact, I was in college at the time. It was this sort of shocking event. But maybe you can go back and just sort of narrate the high points of what happened in the hijacking first, and then we'll talk more about it.
Sure. Well, so I think to put it in context, even though there was a lot of terrorism in the 1980s and the 1970s, plane hijackings, airports being blown up, all kinds of things going on, but they weren't happening, by and large, they weren't happening to Americans. And if they were if an American got caught up in it, it was primarily a military person, not civilians. 9/11 was really the turning point for that. So just to give you the context, so Leon Klinghoffer was 69 years old. He was in a wheelchair. He had suffered 2 strokes. His wife, Marilyn, was 58. She was in remission from cancer. They were sort of prototypical children of immigrant Jews in New York. He was very successful. His big claim to fame, had he not been killed on the Achille Lauro, would be that he invented the roto-broiler, which in the 1950s was this kitchen appliance that meant you really had a super fancy modern kitchen. And they had this group of friends that they were very close to, that they lived with, that all had summer places, not fancy houses, little condos in the Jersey Shore. And this group of friends all decided with Marilyn that it was going to be sort of a last hurrah, that they were going to go on a cruise together. And Marilyn would be celebrating her 59th birthday. They'd be celebrating their 36th wedding anniversary. And the friends were going to come partly to help Marilyn take care of Leon. And at that time, there was no accessibility, no ADA requirements. So Marilyn spent a lot of time over that summer trying to find a ship that had doors wide enough to let Leon's wheelchair go through, and that had an inside elevator so that he could get from one floor to the other. And so this cruise was supposed to go from Genoa to Naples to Alexandria in Egypt, where a lot of passengers were going to get off and go see the pyramids, and then they were going to take a bus and meet the boat and the rest of the passengers in Port Said, and then continue on to Ashdod in Israel, and then return to Italy. That was the plan, a 10-day cruise. And they started off, everything was going fine. What they didn't know, that when they boarded the ship in Genoa, 4 young Palestinians boarded the boat too. One was 17, one was 20, one was 21, the oldest was 23, and in their luggage they had AK-47s. There was absolutely no security. You could just walk on, pack your machine guns, and go. And these 4 young men were part of what was called the Palestinian Liberation Front. It was part of the umbrella organization of the Palestinian Liberation Organization run by Yasser Arafat, but there were several different groups involved. And at the time, I was talking about it with Claire earlier, Arafat was trying to negotiate peace. It was the beginning of the road to Oslo, but he had to play to his base. And so he had these other militant arms of the PLO that would go off and do what they called military operations, we called terrorism. And so these 4 young men were part of that group. It was a crazy operation. If it hadn't had such a tragic ending, it would have been a Keystone Cops episode.
Right. Now, but so the PLF, the subset of the PLO, was run by Abu Abbas, right?
Correct.
Now, what was the relationship between Abu Abbas and Yasser Arafat like?
It was tense.
Yeah.
Because basically Abu Abbas didn't trust Arafat, join the rest of the world.
Right.
He was born in Iraq. He had a classic story of a Palestinian from that era. He was born in a refugee camp in 1948. His in what is now Israel, was then Palestine. After the state of Israel was formed, they fled. They moved to Syria. He grew up in a refugee camp. He was a smart guy. He went to college, started to be a teacher, got caught up in leftist politics, and eventually joined this PLF and was a charismatic person and became the leader of this group and became, like so many Palestinians living in that region, had one single thought, which was to get back to where they had come from.
And now their aim, supposedly, in conducting this hijacking was to secure the release of a number of Palestinians who were being held by the Israelis. Was that a real aim, or was that a pretextual?
That was the aim that came up after the hijacking went south. Originally, the plan of this, if you think about it, were 4 people really going to try to hijack a ship? A ship is very different from an airplane. In an airplane, you're in a very tight quarters, and if you have 4 people with a gun, that's it. A ship is very large. I think as a plan to hijack it, it would have been even stupider than the plan that they had. Their plan was to use the ship as a taxi to go ultimately to Ashdod, get off the ship, and then just start shooting. And you have to understand the context of this. This is 1985. This is before the Intifadas. At that time, Israel seemed absolutely impregnable to the Palestinians. And so Abbas was obsessed with breaching the Israeli firewall. And he had had one mission after another, sending people with, and they all ended disastrously, on motorboats or with gliders, all these things. And the people, and often a civilian got killed unintentionally, and the Palestinians ended up in jail. That's how he ended up with so many men in Israeli jails, because they had these cockamamie schemes that just really didn't work. And so with this scheme, the idea was they were supposed to get off, and each one of these young men firmly believed that they were going to die. That I truly believe. They thought this was going to be a suicide mission. And they had no escape plan. Is this on? Yeah. They had no escape plan, really. It was very murky. And so what happened was, they were on the ship. The youngest one, who was 17, had a passport of somebody twice as old as he was. And I think one of them had a Norwegian passport, one had an Argentinian passport. They didn't speak any of these languages. It
wasn't a highly sophisticated operation.
No, correct. And so what happened was, when the cleaning people came in to clean the cabin, they freaked out. They thought they were being spied on. And they decided to hijack the ship. So the release of the prisoners came into play later, when they had hijacked the ship, and now they didn't know what to do with it. So when they were trying to get released at one of the ports in the area, and that's when there eventually became communication with the U.S. and with outside forces. They started to try to bargain. So that was an afterthought.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit more of the politics surrounding this, but before I do that, I just want to turn to Sean a little bit and ask you to describe the attitude, the shift in attitude that you detect post 9/11 around terrorism, because that's what really sort of ties your work together with Julie's decision to go back into this incident and write about it as a post 9/11 journalist.
Well, I mean,
talk about that a little.
You mean from a political perspective?
Yeah, and sort of how you feel, the perspective on this incident is so different from the way that we think about terrorism, that Americans approach terrorism now, post 9/11.
Right, and I think Julie sort of hinted upon this, that there were these acts of terrorism that only nominally sort of involved Americans historically and were principally committed abroad. And, I think the lens through which we viewed this activity changed dramatically when it was visited on our own shores, to so many people that, we interacted with on a daily basis. It just sort of dramatically changed, our vantage point quite broadly. But the one thing I would say is, I still think that from the perspective of at least some political actors, many of the same problems that arose in the context of the Klinghoffer's case continue to animate legal cases that are brought, even today. Because at the end of the day, there's an inherent political foreign policy dimension to all of these matters, whether you treat them as events, or legal cases. And people who control our foreign policy don't like other people playing around in their sandbox very much. And anytime family communities decide that they want to pursue justice on their own, that they want to drive for answers, that they want accountability that can't be achieved because the actors are beyond the reach of U.S. prosecution or the will of political actors, you're running into this tension between the rights of individuals, the interests of individuals, and the sometimes contrary interests of policymakers who are trying to decide how to manage world affairs in a way that fits a particular agenda in a moment.
Right. And so we're going to get to the legal case in a moment, and in a way the legal case that came from Leon Klinghoffer's murder was very much the precursor to the kind of litigation, Sean, that you're doing in representing 9/11 victims against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So we're going to get to those issues in just a minute. Before we do, let's talk about some of the political circumstances that led to this killing. In the book, you do it's incredibly gripping, your chapter 4, where you describe what happened on that fateful day. And in fact, we're right at the 34th anniversary, aren't we? Because it happened on October 7th, 1985, right? So
yeah, it was actually really interesting. As I said, I belong to the same synagogue as Ilsa and Lisa, and on October 8th was Kol Nidre, which is the Jewish day of remembrance and mourning and reflection and atonement. And it was also the 34th anniversary of Leon Klinghoffer's death, so it was a very,
very, very painful
moment.
And one of the things you describe in the book, it's kind of fascinating, in the run-up to the killing, is the way that the passengers were sitting around and playing cards with the terrorists. And, the terrorists were giving them cigarettes and ordered sandwiches for them, even put a blanket on Leon Klinghoffer as he sat there in his wheelchair. It just gave me goosebumps to read that and to think that, a short 24 hours later, they'd be shooting him and throwing him overboard.
Well, I think it wasn't they, though. It was one of them. And I think this is the part of the story when I think you asked, or you mentioned, like, I have said that there was a mythology that grew up around this, and I think that, I think in the narrative of the Klinghoffer case, we like good guys and bad guys and cops and robbers and everything sort of very simplified, but the hijackers were very different one from the other, and the three of them were very much motivated by their desire to be soldiers, and they saw themselves as on this mission to return to the homeland that none of them had actually ever had. They were too young. They were already a generation removed from having been born in that place. But they were driven, they were all brought up in refugee camps. There was no internet. They had no context outside of the information that they'd been fed and the propaganda that they'd been fed. The oldest one, was Mulkey. What had happened was they ended up hijacking the ship by accident, and once that it became clear that the ship was hijacked, there's this international frenzy of what to do, and led by the U.S., especially because there were U.S. passengers on this ship. It was a very international group of passengers, but there were U.S. passengers on the ship, and the Reagan White House made a decision not to let the ship dock at any port in the Middle East. And so, because they would let the hijackers off. So instead of letting them off, they kept them on the ship, and it was sort of, the ship was then in transit, not knowing. These four, all of a sudden, they were in so far over their heads, and they were getting along with the passengers. When Marilyn Klinghoffer wrote notes about what had happened, she said they seemed so middle class. They seemed like nice young men. And what had happened was, Mulkey, who was supposedly the leader of this ragtag band, started to panic, and he became very concerned that the U.S. Or the West, in any event, was going to land helicopters on a top deck. These ships are enormous, and there was a top deck that didn't have elevator access, and it wasn't meant for passengers. There were no guardrails on it, and he was worried that helicopters might land with commando teams or something to take them out.
And in fact, that's what Oliver North wanted to do.
Right.
It's exactly what Oliver, right. And our approach to these terrorist cases, in fact, has gotten much more sophisticated.
Right.
But at the time, the idea that there should be this kind of commando raid
Was definitely floating around.
and you describe in the book how North had his own troubles, as we know. Iran-Contra was starting to break, and he really wanted to distract attention.
Yeah, I have that great document in my files where Oliver North sends a note to McFarlane, his boss, Robert McFarlane, and said, we really need to make this Achille Lauro a win because to distract attention from Iran-Contra. He wrote that in
Actually, he
hand
wrote
on this.
that.
I
It's
have it on
really
my phone. It's just kind of amazing.
And he wasn't going to succeed in that ambition if there wasn't some dramatic gesture that the U.S. was trying to engage.
Right, so because of that, Moltke decided he separated the American and the British passengers from the other passengers because he felt the Americans and the British were allies of Israel. And so he decided to send them up onto this top deck with open barrels of kerosene so that it would be too dangerous for a helicopter to land because they might injure one of these passengers.
Right.
And so they're all, and it was like a ladder, not really a staircase to climb up. And Leon was in a wheelchair and he couldn't go. And Marilyn didn't want to be separated from him, his wife, who is a remarkable woman. And they said, no, you have to go. And so all of a sudden, instead of being surrounded by his friends and his wife who had been with him, he was alone down there. And then what happened is an incredible mystery. And I think Moltke changed his story nine ways from Sunday, but he isolated Klinghoffer. He took him, the passengers were all gathered together in a big dining hall where the passengers would go for dinner. He isolated Klinghoffer and took him to another deck far away, and he killed him out of sight. And then he tried to throw the body overboard, and he couldn't, so he goes back and he commandeers a hairdresser and a bartender or a waiter who worked for the ship and made them come and do this horrible thing and threatened them that if they would tell anybody, he would kill them. Meantime, the other three hijackers don't know this has happened, and they don't find out about it till later. Right. And in fact, one of them was up in the upper deck with the captain the whole time. And when they found out about it, during the trial, they were all fighting with each other because they couldn't believe that Moltke would kill an old man in a wheelchair, because to them that completely defeated their image of themselves as warriors. Right. And so, but it became, those distinctions weren't really made in the press coverage of it, and not that it really made a difference. It was a heinous act, but it was a different act. It wasn't this concerted, thought-out plot to kill Leon Klinghoffer. He was truly an innocent bystander.
Right. So let's talk now about what happened. And in fact, I met Ilse and Lisa Klinghoffer. I met you because I met the Klinghoffers when we were doing a conference and a project called Using Law to Fight Terror. And what we were interested in looking at is whether or not civil suits and criminal actions, but at the time we were focused on civil suits, could actually function as a deterrent. How effective could they be? And the Klinghoffer case was really one of the first to do this, because Marilyn Klinghoffer, with sadly only a few months to live herself after she got off the Achille Laurel, decided to sue Yasser Arafat, sort of unprecedented legal case. And she spent, and then the daughters took it over, 12 years, all in all, fighting the jurisdictional issues connected with that. And the book doesn't really deal with the legal side of it, more the political side of it, but Sean knows this sort of litigation all too well. So can you, Sean, tell us a little bit about the jurisdictional hurdles And in what way did the Klinghoffer case pave the way for the litigation that you're doing right now?
Sure. So I think, first and foremost, it represented one of the early efforts just to deploy the civil justice system in this way. And then, as that case unfolded, was animated by a number of legal challenges that you continue to see in many of the, subsequent terrorism cases. First of all, the Palestinian Authority asserted that it was entitled to immunity as a foreign state. It ended up being determined that it was not entitled to claim status as a foreign state.
It's pretty remarkable that, right, the Palestinian Authority claiming, well, we have sovereign immunity because we're a state, and of course, statehood was very much what was at issue.
Correct, but obviously then these cases have evolved to include claims against defendants who are in fact foreign states, and so the immunity principles associated with bringing a civil claim against a foreign state in U.S. courts have continued to feature prominently in cases from the Lockerbie bombing to the embassy bombings to any range of Hamas attacks and all the way up through the 9/11 litigation. The Klinghoffer's also had to grapple with, principles of personal jurisdiction, whether or not courts in the United States have personal jurisdiction over defendants who do not reside here and who act abroad and engage in acts of terrorism. And that is an area that has, in my view, become even more difficult, at least in the cases against non-sovereign defendants. So for instance, if you're suing a bank that's alleged to have complicitly laundered funds on behalf of a terrorist organization but has no continuing presence in the United States, isn't at home here within the current framework of the general jurisdiction theories. So you have difficult personal jurisdiction challenges. You had, if I recall correctly, they also had political question doctrine questions raised in the Klinghoffer case, which is the notion that this case presents a non-justiciable political question that the courts really aren't suited to hear and that should reside exclusively with the political branches of government. I think that in many ways those have fallen by the wayside by virtue of Congress's increasing determinations to enact specific legislations that aimed at making sure our courts are available for these cases. So, but all of the basic legal principles that they confronted in the Klinghoffer case continue to show up in all of the terrorism cases that you see now.
Right. Now, so eventually what happened, of course, is that the Klinghofers did win the right to sue on the grounds that the PLO did not have sovereign immunity, as you said, and whereupon the case settled instantly. So in fact, we didn't get to see how that would have played out. But what if this case came up today? How would it fare under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, the exception for state sponsors of terrorism, and so on? Yeah, so I think the determination as to the availability of immunity defenses would be the same, and there would be a determination that there were no sovereign immunity defenses available. The personal jurisdiction issues, arguably are a bit different. The Supreme Court sort of changed its view of when a defendant should be viewed as having a presence in the United States sufficient to exercise jurisdiction. So I think that would have been a difficult standard, but you always have this ability to argue that the defendant is amenable to jurisdiction under specific theories of jurisdiction, the notion being that they've directed intentional tortious conduct at the United States, at the forum, such that they should be amenable to suit here. So, how is this, can you tell us a little bit about how this has played out in your litigation and how this, the sort of various twists and turns that your case has gone through on sovereign immunity issues?
Sure, so there's two distinct issues. So there's the sovereign immunity issue that we've sort of had protracted litigation about involving claims against the government of Saudi Arabia. Now, the prevailing view in the circuit courts is that foreign governments aren't persons such that they're not entitled to due process. So with regard to foreign state defendants, you don't necessarily have to deal with those personal jurisdiction issues under the due process clause, but you have to deal with foreign sovereign immunity. So putting that aside, we had claims against any number of non-state actors who were alleged to have had supportive relationships with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda front entities during the period before, including banks and others. And those were sort of dominated by personal jurisdiction defenses. And they have proven to be difficult cases in terms of the showing that the courts have required, both with regard to, in a pre-discovery phase, the defendant's intent to direct conduct at the United States in particular,
Right.
and with regard to, sort of principles of effectively causation embedded in the due process analysis, the nexus between their conduct and the resulting harm. So whether or not the general funding, for instance, of Al-Qaeda during the early period in the 1990s when bin Laden was building the organization is sufficiently tied to 9/11 to hold a defendant accountable in U.S. courts. So those have been very difficult cases, particularly with regard to banks in the Second Circuit. I suspect that New York's status as a hub of financial activity in the world has featured a bit in the decision-making process of the courts about whether or not to allow banks to be sued there.
Right, so this is, let me just, to compare the cases though, this is like a sort of Al-Qaeda functioning a little like the PLO here, with the Saudi kingdom distancing themselves and saying, hey, we didn't sponsor this organization.
Yeah.
There may be individuals who have relationships here, but we're not the sponsoring organization.
Yeah, there's always these
States.
difficult issues of attribution and whether or not people intended to engage in these kind of activities, and then just a whole other set of issues with the foreign state defendants.
So would this be the equivalent of this case, would be like suing Al-Qaeda as opposed to suing the Saudis, right? And it makes you realize just how crazy this case must have looked at the time that it was brought.
Yeah, I mean, suing the perpetrators, and I think there was an evolution of the way that people thought about terrorism in the ensuing years as attacks became bolder, more sophisticated, and required, broader platforms and resources. And the notion was that, holding the individual terrorist who's responsible for the acts accountable may not be a sufficient way of deterring terrorism. And that, the law needed to take a step further to reach the people who were providing the funding and resources. The notion in a lot of the cases being that money is the lifeblood of terrorism, and organizations like Al-Qaeda that want to function, on a global platform have to have money to pay, $10 million a year to the Taliban to remain their safe haven. They have to pay the people who are actually fighters salaries. They have to support their families. They have to do all of these things. And so that, I think, has been one of the principal arcs of these cases over the years, the aim to get to the financial angels who make all of this activity possible. The difficulty then, though, is establishing their intent to facilitate the underlying conduct conducted by others.
Right, now here we didn't have any problem with intent, and indeed you say in the book that you thought that in fact the killer in this case, as you put it, hated Americans even more than he hated Israelis. Do you think that Klinghoffer was targeted because he was American?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, at the time, the Israelis actually, who were very involved in this sort of advising, spying, helping the U.S.
Right.
sort of circling around, almost immediately after Klinghoffer was killed, the Israelis were saying he was killed because he was Jewish, and that became became the narrative, and that I think is 99% sure that that's not the case, that it was because he was American, because there was no way that these 4 hijackers who didn't speak English, who didn't know, an American passport doesn't say what your religion is, that also became a political football at the
And do you think
time.
that narrative contributed to the sort of controversial nature of the case, and indeed to the making of this very controversial opera, which portrayed the PLO or PLF in this case as freedom fighters?
It did, but if you actually look at the opera's incredibly sympathetic to Marilyn and Leon Klinghoffer.
As well, yeah.
And I think it really doesn't condone the actions of the terrorists. I think it lets them explain why they're there. And and in my book, I do the same. I mean, these were people who truly believed in what they were doing, just as Al Qaeda does. And I think part of the question is it doesn't mitigate the crime, but it does help explain it. And I think from a foreign policy point of view, it's a whole other question. If you don't look at the reasons that people are doing this, then we just, as we see in the Middle East, we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. I did want to say something that was interesting, what you were saying about the banks and looking at the banks. In the end, the Klinghoffer family was understandably wanting to have some kind of justice.
Right.
And the U.S. tried to have the hijackers extradited from Italy, where they were ultimately captured, to the U.S., and that didn't take hold. And the hijackers were tried. They went to jail in Italy. I think in that respect, justice was served, but it wasn't satisfying in some way. And they really wanted to have Abu al-Abbas, who was the leader, brought to justice here. And he wasn't extradited by Italy. Italy, in fact, helped. I mean, it's a pretty interesting part of the story, the way that Italy actually helped spirit him out of the country to get him to Yugoslavia, which was sympathetic to the PLO.
And why did they do that?
Because he was a hot potato. Nobody wanted
to touch
one
him.
of the most interesting parts of this story was the way it was like, get these guys out of here. The Egyptians lied to the U.S. and said the hijackers weren't there. They'd already left. The Israelis had Mubarak, who was the president at the time in Egypt, they had his office wiretapped, and they were telling the Americans, Mubarak's lying, we know that the hijackers are there. So they get the hijackers out, the Americans force them down in Italy. Italy takes jurisdiction of them, and they also had Abu al-Abbas, but Abu al-Abbas had been sent there by Arafat to get this straightened out, and he had diplomatic immunity. And the Italians didn't want to deal with it because Craxi, who was the president at the time, was trying to be friendly with the PLO. He had friendly relationships with them, but he really needed the alliance of Reagan and the U.S. So he just wanted him out, so he didn't have to deal with extradition. And interestingly, the way Abu al-Abbas ended up dying in an American prison in Iraq after 9/11, after we invaded Iraq, he was just swept up in the house of cards, or the whatever it was called, the deck of cards.
And did they realize who they had on their hands?
They had no idea. His name was still floating around. Israel, meantime, had given him, forgiven him, and he had been back to Israel for conferences in Gaza. The whole thing is surreal, actually, when you see the way these things play out in reality.
Yeah.
But the Klinghofers ultimately got a little bit of feeling of justice because Mansour al-Qassar, who was the international arms dealer who was best friends with Abu al-Abbas, was, and supplied the arms. The arms for the Achille Lauro were nothing. A few AK-47s, you used to be able to buy them at Walmart. I guess they stopped selling them. But he was a very close friend of Abu al-Abbas, but he also ended up getting captured in the U.S., not for the Achille Lauro, but because he was selling arms he became part of the cartel and FARC in South America, and the DEA brought him in. And so there's a remarkable moment where Lisa and Elsa Klinghoffer, he's the last person standing from this whole scenario, and he's now serving numerous life imprisonment.
But on totally different
charges, and has never, but as a little side note, his name shows up when Oliver North was trying to do in the Iran-Contra deal. He did a little business through an intermediary with Mansour al-Qassar as well.
Yes.
So
the politics can be quite hideous. Let's talk about another recent murder, the murder of Jamil Khashoggi. Because so many of these political forces surrounding the the killing, these sort of high-profile, highly politicized killings, and then the role that diplomacy between the relevant states play is so complicated and so complicates the quest for justice. Sean, to you about the relationship between the various administrations in the U.S. since 9/11 and the Saudi kingdom. Obviously, the Trump administration took a lot of heat for not coming down harder on Saudi Arabia, and MBS is now starting to get back into the good graces of the U.S., maybe the international community again. How much do international politics really interfere with the attempt to get justice in this sort of case?
Well, I mean, Julie and I were talking about this beforehand. As much as these are legal cases, they're also political cases, and you really need to recognize that on the front end. And we've seen sort of consistent, and I think for different reasons, resistance within the executive branch to sort of a fulsome inquiry into the full nature of Saudi involvement in the growth of Al-Qaeda, the sponsorship of Al-Qaeda, the intersection between the kingdom's religious activities globally and the rise of both the ideology and the organization, as well as particular individual actors and the hijackers. And as I said, I think that you see how temporal political considerations oftentimes dominate these issues. In the aftermath in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, my personal view is that there was sort of a recognition of the degree to which the kingdom's activities and religious activities and promotion of certain ideologies had contributed to the problem, and there was an inflection point about whether or not we were going to call them out publicly for this and try to hold them account, or try to draw them in as part of the solution. And I think the decision was made that pointing a finger at them would just cause them to pull away, and that we needed them on the team to try and bring this problem under control going forward. And that in that period, I think, created a tremendous resistance to what we were trying to do in the civil litigation. And so we had opposition, during, the Bush administration. We were in front of the Supreme Court on a cert petition seeking review of Second Circuit decision affirming the kingdom's dismissal from our case in late 2008 and early 2009. And the Obama administration was called to file an amicus brief through the Solicitor General, who was then Elena Kagan. And it was essentially one of the first amicus briefs they were filing in the nascent Obama administration, when they had a range of issues on the table, going from, whether or not the Saudis were going to be willing to take the Yemenis from Guantanamo Bay so that we could close Guantanamo Bay, whether or not the Saudis were going to be willing to make, some overture or some significant gesture or concession that would provide momentum for the Middle East peace process. In all likelihood, the early thinking about the Iran nuclear deal and how the Saudis were likely to react to that. President Obama's broader outreach to the Muslim world via the speech, in Cairo that happened right around the same exact moment.
Well, and then thereafter, Obama's vetoing of the JASTA bill, which is really extraordinary, which passed unanimously in Congress, and there, towards the end of his administration, the last 6 months of his administration, the JASTA bill that was intended to allow the kingdom to be sued.
Yeah, and so I think that had a lot to do with what happened in the early phases of the administration, where they had this basket of policy agenda items, and they saw the Saudis as being relevant and significant to all of them, and they said, is this a good moment for us to be alienating them by, weighing in support of a 9/11 community in an amicus brief to the Supreme Court? And they said no, and they went the other direction. And I think that they were held hostage by that decision for the duration of his administration. I think it likely locked him into his position in vetoing the law that we eventually got passed over his veto. I think, though, that President Trump's affinity, not even sure if it's for the Saudis or if it's just for Mohammed bin Salman, it has a totally different logic behind it. Completely different.
Different than the Obama administration.
Okay, that's a fair question.
Is there logic?
Is there logic to it?
Right. Is it just money for weapons, or is there something more to it? But you see that in all of these cases, and they have real world consequences, because as we encountered in 2008 and 9 and a couple other times, the Solicitor General's been asked to weigh in with the views of the United States in our case twice in petitions before the Supreme Court. The process that led to, Claire referred to JASTA, it was a law that we got passed after a 7-year legislative process that created a new exception to foreign sovereign immunity that was designed to enable the 9/11 claims against the kingdom. But there we fought with the State Department tooth and nail behind the scenes, because they really didn't want this to happen. We ended up having to overcome a presidential veto. Even after it got passed, there was tremendous amount of activity behind the scenes to try and have it gutted immediately after it was passed.
And the Saudis who pushed against the legislation, who pushed to have the legislation reversed actually after it passed, and our response, other governments' response to that, which is we don't seem to want to piss off the Saudis, even when they murder our residents, our journalists,
Right.
in cold blood, right?
Right, and again, we're still, we're now directly adverse to U.S. agencies, because we were eventually, after we got the law passed, we were authorized for the first time after 15 years of litigation to proceed with discovery. Literally the first discovery against the kingdom itself after 15 years. And the discovery that we were authorized to conduct was focused on whether or not 2 Saudi government employees in the United States had provided direct aid and assistance to the 2 first arriving September 11 hijackers, and whether they did so, at the direction of more senior Saudi officials. And for years, the kingdom had a very active public relations claim to assert that the 9/11 Commission looked at all of these issues, found that there was no wrongdoing by the Saudi government employees in issue, and nothing wrong on the part of the kingdom. The U.S. government, the executive branch, did nothing to sort of counter that narrative that they were offering in briefs, that they were offering, in the public domain. And when we eventually got to discovery, we sent a subpoena to the FBI, and the Department of Justice came in and for the first time said, the 2 Saudi government employees they're asking about are the subjects of active and ongoing criminal and counterterrorism investigations to this day. And there's a 3rd subject whose name we don't want to tell you, who tasked them to do it. So,
Wow, it's an admission of your case, but yet they want you to leave it alone.
Yeah, and so now, we've been litigating for a year and a half with the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, over whether or not they're going to respond to our subpoenas. They've asserted state secrets to a bunch of information. They're uniquely in possession of the information that runs to the heart of the case. And, 17 years later, they're saying, among other things, we can't give it to you because we might prosecute someone.
So what we see in effect, and tell me if this resonates at all in the Klinghoffer cases, is the government sort of interfering with the attempt to get individual justice for victims of terrorism because it messes up their diplomacy too much. It complicates other aims that they have, other investigations that they have, and the individual justice for the individual victims becomes a lower priority almost soon as the case has passed.
Well, actually, I think in the Klinghoffer case, it was the opposite.
Right.
I think it was the opposite, because I think in that, it's sort of, you just have to look at where the politics aligns with the agenda of the administration.
Yes,
So,
right.
when Leon Klinghoffer was murdered, Ronald Reagan came into office in 1980, largely on the back of Jimmy Carter's failure with the Iranian hostage crisis.
Yes.
And, Reagan came into office saying, I'm going to I'm going to defeat terrorism. I mean, it wasn't his primary agenda. His primary was defeating the Soviet Union, but certainly this terrorism was a major source of political capital for him in his campaigning. And then he discovered terrorism isn't so easy to control. You know, they had the Marine barracks bombed in Lebanon and the hijacking of the TWA plane. It was a nightmare for him and his administration, politically as well as from a humanitarian point of view. And so when the Achille Lauro happened, that's why so many people within his White House National Security Council and then this little counterterrorism group that Oliver North was involved in, it was very much important to them to have this be a win because they had so many losses in the Middle East before that.
Yet we continue to try to develop diplomatic relations with the PLO and with Yasser Arafat. So that's, I mean, you know, that didn't set us back diplomatically as you might think it would, any more than the Trump administration has taken a hard line on the Saudis because of Khashoggi.
Right, but I think, you know, you have to understand that for the PLO, that's just business as usual. Even within the PLO, they have multiple agendas going on. We're operating for peace here. We're sending off people to do acts of terrorism over here. So if the U.S. responds in kind, it doesn't seem unusual. It seems like business as usual. And so I think for Reagan, you know, he embraced the Klinghoffer family. He called them immediately after he had a meeting with Marilyn Klinghoffer and the daughters at the Waldorf Astoria after she came home. And I'm not to say that he wasn't personally touched by it, but it also served a really strong political purpose for him.
Right, and for Oliver North.
And for Oliver North.
I want to get your comments and questions in, so why don't we open it up to the audience, and we'll see where it goes. And let's get, we have two people operating mics, let's get two questions teed up at once so we can go right from the next, from one to the next. Here's the first question over here.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I had one question about the Saudi Arabian cases. It sounds, you mentioned that they're very difficult cases. Have you actually gotten an award for a client in any of these cases, or are they just such a maze of steps you have to go through that's never been concluded?
So, and Xander can probably speak to that if she wants to. You know, there have been awards in any number of these cases against designated state sponsors of terrorism. So, you know, as this body of law was evolving, you know, there was an interest, you know, in the 1990s to find a path for accountability for holding states accountable for events like the Lockerbie bombing involving Libya. And there was a, you know, sort of fearsome debate, you know, at the time about whether or not it would be appropriate to create an exception to sovereign immunity for these kinds of terrorism cases. And so the first step in this process, at least with regard to state actors, the balance that Congress struck was to say, well, we'll let you bring these cases if the defendant is one of the designated state sponsors of terrorism, which is a list that's in a bit of flux, you know, over time, but, you know, Iran, Sudan, you know, have featured prominently. And so there have been quite a number of judgments issued against Iran, Sudan, and others. And there have been mixed results in collecting on those. There have been some, you know, notable successes where, you know, secret Iranian assets have been unmasked and people have, you know, successfully attached to them. There have also been some successes arising from creation of funds for the benefit of judgment holders by the U.S. government. And actually, in the last couple of years, there's been like $3 billion distributed from one of those funds, or I guess the third tranche is coming up. So there have been, you know, significant successes in that way. You know, I have a very large judgment against Iran for probably $7 billion, but you know, we'll see whether or not I succeed in collecting it. You know, in the Saudi case, you know, we're just at the point where we're in discovery proceeding to the point where we're going to try to get a judgment if they have the appetite to go that far in the proceeding. So we'll have to see. I think it was, fine from their perspective to spend quite a bit of time litigating esoteric principles of foreign sovereign immunity in U.S. courts without ever addressing the true merits of the case. Since we've been in discovery, I think that they've been fortunate because the court has maintained essentially all of the evidence that's been developed so far under seal. Everything that we're getting from the FBI is subject to an attorney's eyes only protective order, so there's only very few people who have seen the production from the FBI that relates to the investigation they conducted of these Saudi officials in the United States. So, it's all proceeding out of the public eye, but at some point that's obviously going to change. And we'll see what kind of appetite they have at that moment to, have all of this on full display for the public to see.
Thank you.
May I add to that comment, if you will? So, yes, as he said, there are some people who have successfully won their suits against assorted governments. If the government's on the magic list that he mentioned, the state sponsors of terrorism, even if you're unable to collect against the government itself, there is this fund, the U.S. Victims of Terrorism Fund, that you can apply to with your judgment. But it's really hard in any case you have against a government to be able to attach their assets. And so, as was mentioned, with Iran, it's especially hard, but every once in a while something percolates up. People in the audience might be familiar with the Otto Warmbier situation regarding North Korea. The Warmbier family has sued North Korea, received a default judgment, and I believe it's still pending, but they're in the process of trying to attach a North Korean merchant marine vessel, which you may have also seen in the news, was at one point captured by the US government, and they're in litigation right now to try and attach that, as it's called, to get money from that in satisfaction of their judgment. If they don't, they could still apply to the fund and get money for that. So there are means, they are complicated, they are long, and a lot of the victims and these families would tell you that it's not about the money, it's about the principle.
Another question up here, I think, please, attention, please. And if someone on this side wants to raise their hand, we'll get another mic teed up for us for another question.
If the Klinghoffer trial had been allowed to proceed to court, usually, it's a trial takes place, criminal trial takes place where the act occurred. So where would the trial have taken place?
You mean the criminal trial? Well, that's, I think, why you mean the trial for the kidnap, for the hijacking. Yeah, I think that's ultimately why the trial took place in Italy. I mean, it was a little murky because the killing took place in the Mediterranean and on the seas. It was an Italian ship, an American victim, and so the PLO actually wanted the trial to take place, I don't know where, in Tunisia, which is where their headquarters were. But I think the U.S. they were trying to have the trial take place in New York, which is where Leon Klinghoffer was from, but it really didn't go very far. There was a whole team of people from the Department of Justice, FBI people, attorneys who went and they did a lot of interrogatories of all the hijackers. They did not interview Abou Abbas because he was spirited out of the country. I mean, ultimately, I think from a criminal prosecution point of view, it did have a good result. The hijackers were brought to trial. They were tried in Italy. It was a very, very high-profile trial, as you can imagine, in Genoa. But I think you're right. I think those jurisdictional issues were one of the reasons that they couldn't, the extradition went nowhere, and the U.S. didn't really push very hard for it. I think in the end, if they had pushed a little harder, they might have been able to get the hijackers extradited, but I think they realized that it was going to be, I think once the Italians said that they had, that they were going to prosecute, there was going to be a trial, I think that was satisfactory to the U.S. officials at the time.
Well, in fact, we usually want criminal trials to take place in the jurisdiction from which the defendant comes from. We don't really want those cases particularly, but civil claims might be a different matter. And it seems to me we have a rather more ambivalent relationship with conducting these civil trials on U.S. soil, and sort of how we hold them a little bit at arm's length.
Yeah, but I think the civil case would have happened here.
Oh,
had
the
it gone
civil
to
case
trial.
would have
Civil
happened.
case
Oh, for
certainly
sure,
happens
it was
here,
filed here. I think part of the problem is where were the defendants from? I mean, they were from nowhere. They were stateless people, so that's also a problem.
And of course, this is a problem with piracy
Right.
as well, and trying to use civil action to in any way get at pirates. And piracy is very difficult. There was a question over here. Yeah.
Hi, this is about the Saudi Arabia litigation. I'm wondering if your case has interacted at all with the ongoing Guantanamo hearings, and if the scheduling of the trial date for Khashoggi Mohammed is in any way going to impact your case.
So it's funny. The answer is sort of yes. We issued a subpoena effectively. There's an entire process for people who are in custody in that setting, but because we wanted to depose Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And, he responded through his counsel indicating that, were it not for the fact that he's facing the death penalty, much greater cooperation would be, possible. So there is this interaction, and obviously from his perspective, they were trying to, I think, on some level leverage, the possible cooperation in a civil proceeding as a means to provide an incentive for them to take the death penalty off the table. I think that there was some discussion about that.
Well, in fact,
going
Harvey,
back and forth.
the convening authority, Harvey Rishkoff, who is now teaching right near here at Temple, was presumably fired because of his attempt to broker a deal that would have allowed just exactly that kind of testimony to occur.
So yes, and then more broadly, there's been significant release of information associated with the detainees at Guantanamo, and that has been, a relatively significant source of evidence from our perspective, because there are claims in our case against a number of so-called Saudi charities. They were probably more accurately referred to as what's called a Dawa organization, which is a proselytizing entity that many of which were largely funded by the Saudi government, and several of which were broadly implicated sort of in providing material support to Al-Qaeda in the years before. And so you see, it's funny because as much as, the government may want to control the flow of information, when you have something with this dimension, you suddenly see this very loose language, with the Department of Defense, including entities on a threat matrix of organizations that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda that includes Saudi government agencies, which is sort of funny, but it just sort of sneaks out. So we've had to mine that stuff for evidence along the way, but I don't think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is going to be testifying. We did though, we succeeded in doing a deposition of Zacharias Moussaoui, who was the so-called 20th hijacker. I think that number's it's a little off. At the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. And we spent a couple of days with him, and he gave us testimony, and we are going back to the Supermax facility for potentially 2 other former Al-Qaeda members who appear willing to testify. We'll see what happens when you actually get there, but.
And if you raise your hand if you want to be next on the queue. So
This is a question for Julie. So there were 4 people on an ocean liner, and they're like small cities. Could you just talk a little bit about how they managed to even coordinate with themselves and keep control of a whole ocean liner?
Right. It's pretty extraordinary. So you had 4 young men with these machine guns, and First thing you should realize, most of the passengers were off the ship. There were only about 70 passengers, but there were still 300-something crew members. Most passengers had gotten off to go to the pyramids. And I think when somebody has a machine gun in their hand, they have a lot of authority. And what they did, which was very effective, they went into the dining room at lunchtime, where most of the passengers were, and they just started shooting at the ceiling. And so it created an incredible panic. And one of the crew members ran up to get the captain and said, these guys are hijacking the ship. And the captain made a decision to tell the crew members they did have some guns on the ship, but just rifles. And he told them not to take them out because he felt that more people would be, that would immediately set off a gunfire battle and too many people would be killed. And so basically the captain sort of cooperated in a way with the hijackers to make sure that nobody was killed. So there was this cooperation, and then this sort of Stockholm syndrome set in that Claire was describing, where basically the hijackers, most of the people, the passengers who were left on the ship, they were either sick or very young. There were a few children, like a handful of children, because it was October, so they were very small. And most of the passengers who were left on board were elderly or sick. And so these were fairly frail people to begin with, and so they just listened. And the crew was under orders not to interfere, and they quickly just organized people. They kept them all in this one area. They herded everybody, the crew and the passengers, into this giant ballroom, and three of them were there guarding, and then the fourth one spent most of the days of the hijacking with the captain up in the bridge. And this young man ultimately did a whole series of interviews with an Italian journalist while he was in jail, and everybody wrote a book after it. So the captain, also an Italian, wrote a memoir the year afterward. And it was almost strange because the captain grew quite fond of this young hijacker. Even gave him one of his cufflinks. They had this, there was definitely and if you see pictures, they called one of the hijackers Rambo because he looked like Sylvester Stallone, and it's when the Rambo movies had first come out. So there was this bizarre sort of connection between them, very different from the terrorists we think of as ISIS or later on. And I think the other thing to remember is that these were not religious fundamentalists. They looked at themselves as political, and that actually became a big issue in the Italian trial. In Italy, ultimately, they were convicted on all the charges of hijacking, of murder in the case of Moltke, kidnapping, all these other charges that they did. The court actually threw out the band of terrorists charge. But I think that reflected the sympathy for the PLO that was prevalent in Europe at the time.
Right, and that's an intriguing part of this case and how it unfolded. But when you refer to Stockholm Syndrome, I think that's true, but it's also the recommended way for hostages to deal with their captors. And one of the, in fact, CERL did a program on hostage negotiations. And one of the people we had here discussing it was Ambassador Limbert, who had been the ambassador to Iran and was taken hostage for 9 months in the Iranian embassy during the Iranian hostage crisis. And he describes his relationship with also, in that case, very young terrorists who had, basically students who had taken over the embassy, and how they developed a relationship with them which kind of kept things calm and ultimately resulted in being able to free people without fatalities.
Right, and I think they were en route to that kind of a resolution, but the closing of the port in Syria, there was a point in both the interrogatories with the hijackers and with the captain where they were talking about how after this, at that point, it was 48 hours of this being held hostage, not even 24 hours, and then everything had calmed down because they were going to Tartus. It was this city in Syria, and it was going to be the end of this ordeal, that the hijackers were going to leave the ship and everything was going to be calm. And when the word came out that the port was closed, Mulkey went bananas. It was like a switch flip. And he, I think, completely panicked because he didn't really know what to do.
I'm wondering if the plaintiffs in your suit against the Saudis are the families of the 9/11 victims or the companies that insured the towers or both? And does that make any difference in terms of the remedies you can pursue?
So it's both. It's a sort of interesting collaboration between commercial entities that suffered harm and family members seeking justice, sort of walking shoulder to shoulder in relation to, a terrorist event. The scope of the suit sort of dramatically expanded after we got the law passed. In part as a consequence of the terrible health and humanitarian crisis that's resulted from exposure to conditions at ground zero. So, the suit encompasses not only the families who lost loved ones on 9/11, but now thousands and thousands of people who have either died or become terribly sick as a result of the exposure to conditions at ground zero. In terms of the remedies available, there's not a huge difference. The jurisdictional provision, which is, sovereign immunity is a jurisdictional matter, so the exception to sovereign immunity here provides a basis to bring a claim for physical damage to property, wrongful death, or injury occurring in the United States as a result of an act of international terrorism. So, the property damage, business losses, and human wrongful death and injury are all, encompassed by that. But to the point, the perspective, I think, obviously from the families, and most of them, you can't speak for every person, but most of them is, to get answers, to get justice. There were organizations formed after aimed at bankrupting terrorism, and this was a reflection of the recognition post 9/11 that I talked about earlier, which is, Al-Qaeda was a hugely funded organization, $30-some million a year to maintain its operational budget, and it leaned on that entire infrastructure in order to carry out an attack like 9/11. So, the families felt that if you could attack the sources of that funding, you could debilitate the organization. And as it turned out, their initial reaction in that regard was entirely consistent with the policy that was then implemented via the Treasury Department and others. The notion was, well, let's attack the sources of funding of these organizations, and we will debilitate their ability to carry out large-scale, sophisticated terrorist attacks like 9/11. We'll never be able to stop them from doing the sort of random small attack, on soft targets that we see so much these days. But as a general matter, I do think the strategy of attacking the financial support system has been effective.
Sean, let me just ask you a follow-up question on that. If we were to engage in one reform that might make civil suits against state sponsors of terrorism more effective, what would it be?
I think we took a big step with JASTA in providing a basis for jurisdiction.
So that's just for 9/11.
It's not just for 9/11. It's for any act of terrorism occurring on U.S. soil. There's been discussion about whether or not we should just open up our courts entirely to sort of any claim, by a U.S. victim for an act of terrorism that's sponsored in any way by a state, regardless of where it occurs. I do think that some of the international law principles relating to assuming jurisdiction for wholly extraterritorial acts are a bit more difficult in the sovereign immunity arena, so I think that that might be a bridge too far, at least now. But I do think that, you know, a much better mechanism for victims to have access to evidence in the possession of the United States would be key.
If the mental state, as it were, for states sponsoring terrorism were lower, so that they were aware that their state funds were going to fund terrorism without intending it, I assume that would be a pretty big game changer for this kind of litigation.
Well, we did succeed when we got our law passed at validating aiding and abetting theories. And, you know, the legal standards for aiding and abetting are a bit different, and that kind of reckless disregard can be, you know, certainly adequate with regard to that. The court handling our case made a determination that the money flowing, that we allege was flowing from the kingdom through these purported charities and right out the back door to Al-Qaeda was insufficient to sustain jurisdiction under two theories. One was that we hadn't offered enough to show that they were agents whose actions were attributable to the government. And second, that their conduct in providing this kind of general funding to Al-Qaeda didn't satisfy the causation standard for cases against foreign states. I you know, respectfully disagree. JEST was really designed to reach that kind of conduct, so I do think that you'll get there, you know, at a point in time. But I think access to the evidence would be a significant thing, and they did something similar to this in the 9/11 cases against the airlines, because there was some what they called SSI, sensitive security information, and they did pass legislation to allow the attorneys in the case to be able to review that as part of and necessary to the litigation. I do think one other area, and it's not terrorism per se, but it is in the sovereign immunity arena where some reform is probably warranted, is, you know, some exception to address the increasing problem of foreign state cyber activity.
Yes.
Including, you know, particularly, you know, the activities of, you know, Chinese actors in engaging in, you know, cyber theft of, you know, commercial espionage via advanced, you know, cyber means, and deploying capabilities that are, you know, part of the intelligence and armed, you know, the military services. So that's an area that, and there is an intersection, because, you know, the concern has always been that these cyber capabilities can also be deployed to cause physical harm in the United States as well.
Right.
So for once, maybe we should be forward thinking about it.
Yes.
Lay down a marker to everyone that we're not going to tolerate this activity on the front end, instead of waiting until the bad thing happens and then say, oh boy, you know, we should fix this now after the fact.
We're just about out of time. I want to give you the last word, Julie. If there's one thing you want people to come away with from this book, in terms of lessons to draw or impact for today, what would that be?
So we really didn't talk about it in this context because it wasn't part of the program, but the book looks at really three families: the Klinghoffers, the family of Abu Abbas, and the family of a man called Alex Odeh, who was assassinated, it seems, still a cold case, by the JDL 3 days after Klinghoffer in retaliation. And for obviously different reasons and different ways of things playing out, all three of these families have been deeply affected by the Achille Lauro through the next generation and the next generation. And I guess the question I have, and is do we learn anything from history? I feel that listening to you talk, it feels like no, we don't. Do we look at these events and see different ways of responding to these actions? Do we look at and I think that's the takeaway I think I came away from this was, you know, we have these set ways of looking at things that are motivated by political agendas all the way around, and is there any way to change the way we think about it? And that, who knows? The other thing I would like to say, in listening to talk about the 9/11 families, one of the people I interviewed for the book was a reverend who, after 9/11, there were so many families left feeling, apart from the loss, that it was a double loss because there was no body There was no body. There was no way of identifying the person. And the Klinkhoffers went through that same experience when Leon Klinghoffer was murdered and his body thrown overboard. Ultimately, his body was recovered, and as maybe strange as it sounds, that recovery of the body meant so much to the families. And I think that these lawsuits and litigation, as you said, it's not just a legal question, it's some kind of spiritual closure. Not that maybe you ever have closure per se, but some kind of resolution. And so I think in all of these actions, and I think the difference between Klinghoffer and I think for the 9/11 families, the horror of it is there were so many. There are so many. And I think what made Klinghoffer such a powerful symbol at the time is that the one is sometimes easier to grasp than the many, sadly.
Well, you've certainly written this book with enormous pathos and compassion and given us an amazing window into one such case, and a very important case. So thank you so much for your work. And Sean, thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about the broader legal picture. Please join me in thanking.